A dramatic family scenario headline. It shows text describing a man who was having dinner with his son and daughter-in-law when he suddenly received a mysterious text message from an unknown number telling him, "Get up and go. Now. Don't say anything to your son." He obeyed, and then discovered the police were knocking at their door. On the right side, there's a serious-looking older man in a suit, representing the father. Frank Caldwell sat at the end of the dining table, his posture perfectly straight, his hands resting neatly on either side of the plate. At 63 years old, Frank retained the disciplined composure of his military days. Even in retirement, every movement he made had a certain deliberateness. His silver hair was neatly combed, his shirt tucked in crisply, his eyes alert beneath heavy brows. He wasn't the kind of man who fidgeted. He wasn't the kind of man who ever truly relaxed. Across the table, his son Adam was mid-story, recounting some recent frustration at work involving a delayed shipment and a supervisor who, according to him, wouldn't know a schedule if it bit him on the leg. His wife, Julia, laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, sipping her wine. She was always good at making the air feel lighter, Frank noticed. Maybe that was why Adam had changed after marrying her, more open, more expressive, more casual. The house was modest, 2 stories with a small fenced yard in a quiet Baltimore suburb. The scent of rosemary chicken still hung in the air, the remains of dinner slowly cooling on their plates. On the sideboard, a framed wedding photo caught the glow of the dining room light. There was a strange comfort in the scene, the sound of forks against plates, the low hum of the dishwasher running in the background, the occasional bark of a dog outside. A snapshot of American normalcy. And yet, Frank couldn't shake the sense that something felt off. He told himself it was nothing, just the aftertaste of too much garlic or the unfamiliar softness of civilian life, but even as he smiled politely, nodding at Adam's story, a part of his brain remained vigilant. Old habits died hard. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about instinct. And his instincts were rarely wrong. He reached for his glass of water when his phone vibrated. A short, sharp buzz against the wooden table. That, in itself, was strange. Frank rarely received messages. The phone was a flip model, worn and outdated, used mostly for emergencies or the occasional weather update. His contacts list barely had more than 5 names. He glanced down. 1 message. Unknown number. He opened it. "Get up and go. Now. Don't say anything to your son." The air inside the room seemed to change instantly. He blinked, rereading the message. No punctuation, no name. Just that. "Get up and go. Now." Frank's fingers closed around the phone slowly. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He looked up at Adam, who had just taken another bite of chicken. Julia was reaching for the salad bowl, asking something about weekend plans. Everything looked normal. Ordinary. But Frank's world had just tilted slightly off its axis. He made a decision in a fraction of a second. Rising slowly from his chair, he gave a brief nod. "Excuse me a moment," he said, his voice calm. "You okay, Dad?" Adam asked. Frank gave a quick, reassuring smile. "Yeah. Just need some air." Julia smiled back, unconcerned. "It's a nice evening out." Frank walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. He closed it behind him gently, making sure it didn't click too loudly. Once outside, he inhaled deeply. The street was quiet, the sky turning dark. Porch lights glowed along the block. He stepped down onto the sidewalk and moved a few paces away from the house. Not far. Not running. Just enough to not be seen through the living room window. His heart was steady, but his mind raced. Who sent the message? Why the urgency? And what did they mean by not saying anything to Adam? He turned back briefly, glancing at the window. The shadows of Adam and Julia moved calmly inside, unaware. Then he looked down at the phone again, hoping for another message. None came. Frank was not a man given to panic. His years in service had taught him to observe, assess, and act with purpose. But standing there on that quiet Baltimore street, the chill in his spine told him this was not a drill, not some prank, not a wrong number. This was something real. Something serious. He looked around once more, scanning the street for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the occasional flicker of television lights through neighbors' windows. He moved behind a parked car and crouched, trying to stay out of sight. Every muscle in his body tightened with the familiar edge of readiness. A familiar posture, long forgotten but never truly gone. He waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for. But something told him it wouldn't be long. The street remained quiet, bathed in the dim orange glow of street lamps, as Frank crouched behind the parked sedan. A gentle breeze moved the leaves above him, rustling softly, but his focus was razor-sharp. His fingers clutched the old flip phone tightly. The silence after that lone message felt deafening. No follow-up. No instructions. Just that single line that now echoed in his thoughts louder than the sounds of the night around him. Get up and go. Now. Don't say anything to your son. Frank tried to recall if he had ever given his number out recently, someone who might have had access to his personal contacts, perhaps during a visit to the Veterans Center or at one of the rare reunions with old Navy colleagues. But there was nothing. He had intentionally lived quietly since retirement, away from any unnecessary entanglements. The only people who had this number were his son, Julia, his old friend Cal in North Carolina, and the emergency contact system from the VA. This wasn't a prank. He knew that much. As he remained hidden, he saw movement at the window, Julia passing by, probably clearing dishes. He imagined Adam still seated, maybe wondering why his father hadn't come back in yet. Frank didn't want to think about how this might look. Walking out during dinner, not answering questions. But instincts came first. Instincts were survival. He pulled the phone open again and flipped through the recent calls. No history of incoming numbers. Nothing traceable. Whoever had sent the message had either used a burner or scrambled their ID. That took effort. That suggested planning. Which meant whoever was behind this had anticipated needing his attention in a very specific way. Then, far down the street, the faint echo of an engine. A low growl, slow and deliberate. Frank turned slightly, peering around the rear bumper. A dark vehicle was approaching, black SUV, government style. Tinted windows. No headlights. Moving under the radar. He backed up quietly into the yard adjacent to the sidewalk, kneeling behind a bush, never taking his eyes off the street. The SUV slowed as it neared Adam and Julia's house. It didn't stop immediately, but rather coasted another few feet before rolling to a halt directly in front of their driveway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark civilian suits. They moved with authority, but not aggression. They weren't announcing themselves. No lights, no sirens. But Frank recognized the posture, the pace, federal, definitely not local police. They were carrying. Frank ducked lower. He couldn't hear their voices, but their direction was clear. They approached the house with practiced calm, one ringing the doorbell while the other stayed back, eyes scanning the street. Frank didn't move. Every inch of his training screamed at him to stay down, stay invisible. Julia appeared at the door seconds later, her silhouette framed by the porch light. One of the men showed her something, probably a badge. Frank couldn't hear her response, but her body stiffened. Then she opened the door wider and gestured them in. Frank's jaw tensed. Inside, things were beginning to shift, and he had no idea how much danger Adam was in, or why. Still crouched in the shadows, Frank's phone buzzed again. He flinched slightly at the suddenness of it, the vibration slicing through the quiet like a blade. Another message. Same number. Stay out of sight. Trust me. Don't call anyone. He stared at the screen. The message came through just as the men entered the house. Whoever this was, they were watching. Nearby. possibly closer than he thought. Frank rose slightly, just enough to reposition, then crept along the yard, making his way to the far side of the neighbor's property. He needed cover and a better vantage point. He slipped through the space between fences and crouched near a wooden shed. From there, he could see the front of the house and most of the living room through the large front window, though partially obscured by curtains. Inside, he saw the movement, Adam standing now, talking to the men. His posture wasn't aggressive. But it wasn't relaxed either. His hands were partially raised, not in surrender, but in a way that suggested confusion or frustration. Julia hovered nearby, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. Frank exhaled slowly. They didn't handcuff him. That was something. But they weren't treating this as a casual conversation either. What worried Frank most wasn't the presence of the agents. It was the message. Don't say anything to your son. Why? If Adam was the one in danger, shouldn't Frank warn him? If Adam was the target, shouldn't Frank be inside, helping him face whatever this was? Unless Adam already knew what this was about. Unless Adam wasn't entirely innocent. Frank's chest tightened at the thought, but he pushed the emotion aside. Right now, speculation was useless. He needed data. Facts. The kind he used to operate with before retirement dulled his edge. He could feel the old instincts waking up, piece by piece. Another buzz. This time, a call. He answered instantly, not even looking at the number. Hello? The voice on the other end was low and familiar. A voice he hadn't heard in over 20 years. Frank. It's James. James Monroe. Frank stood up straight, stunned. You're dead. There was a soft exhale on the other end. No. But I needed the world to think I was. Listen to me carefully. I don't have much time. Frank's throat felt dry. Where are you? Not important, James replied. You're being watched. You need to disappear tonight. Get out of Baltimore. Go to Cal's place. Do not go back to the house. Frank's hand clenched the phone tighter. Tell me what's going on. Why are there agents in my son's house? James' voice grew sharper. Because they're not there for you, Frank. They're there for Adam. The words landed like a hammer. What the hell does that mean? It means your son is in deep. Deeper than you know. And the less you're involved, the better for everyone. Especially him. Then why the message? Why tell me to leave? Because if they had found you inside, it would have complicated everything. You showing up on their radar now, after all these years, would trigger flags. Flags that trace back to what we did in Kuwait. What we covered up. You remember, don't you? Frank was silent. You showing your face tonight would have lit up a network of alarms, Frank. That's why I warned you. That's why I'm warning you again, stay out. Don't talk to the feds. Don't talk to Adam. Not yet. Frank's mind was reeling. He tried to form a question, but James had already hung up. The phone went dead in his hand. He stared at it, the silence suddenly pressing down harder than before. Inside the house, the agents were still speaking to Adam. But something had changed. Julia looked scared now. Adam's expression had shifted, he was no longer confused. He looked resigned. As if he had been expecting this all along. Frank took a step back, disappearing deeper into the neighbor's yard. He didn't know what was coming next. But he knew it had already begun. Frank moved quietly between the shadows of the neighboring yard, keeping his head low and his eyes on the road. The sound of James's voice still echoed in his ears, an unwelcome reminder of a past he thought had been buried forever. The last time he'd seen James Monroe was 2 decades ago, on a runway in Kandahar. His funeral had been a closed casket. Frank had stood beside the flag-draped coffin. He remembered shaking the widow's hand. He remembered the folded flag. And now, here he was, alive, whispering warnings from the dark. Frank reached the corner of the block and leaned against a wooden fence, catching his breath. His mind raced through the fragments of information James had given him. The operation in Kuwait. The red flags. The warning not to be found. But more than anything, it was the last thing James said that twisted in his gut: "They're not there for you. They're there for Adam." Frank turned and looked back toward the house. The SUV was still parked in front. No one had left. No backup had arrived. The neighborhood remained still, as if the world had paused to let this moment play out in private. Whatever was unfolding inside those walls was being kept quiet, for now. Then, in the distance, a new sound pierced the night. Faint at first. A high-pitched whine, building steadily. Frank's head snapped toward the source. A siren. It wasn't loud yet, but it was coming fast. Frank stepped out from the fence line and squinted down the road. At first, he saw nothing. But seconds later, headlights crested the far end of the street, flickering red and blue through the trees. A second siren joined the first, then a third. The sound was unmistakable now. Police. Frank ducked into the shadows again and moved quickly toward a row of hedges behind a neighbor's garage. From there, he had a clean view of the house. His pulse quickened as he watched the first cruiser pull up behind the black SUV. Two uniformed officers stepped out, one heading toward the front door while the other stayed back, radio in hand. Inside the house, Frank could just make out Adam's figure through the window. The living room lights dimmed as someone walked past the curtain, pulling it further closed. Then came the loud knock. 3 sharp bangs on the door. Protocol. Commanding but not hostile. Frank's jaw tightened. The federal agents were no longer alone. The second and third cruisers arrived within moments, parking at odd angles along the curb. Their lights cast frantic flashes across the quiet suburban homes, turning calm windows into walls of color. More officers emerged, some with hands near their belts, others moving to secure the perimeter. Frank could tell this wasn't an arrest squad. Not yet. They weren't rushing the house. They weren't drawing weapons. But their presence shifted the entire tone. The moment had gone from quiet inquiry to a controlled public action. It was now official. Visible. And escalating. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. A neighbor peeked out through their curtains. Another opened their door and leaned out, squinting at the lights. Frank cursed under his breath. This kind of attention was dangerous. Not just for Adam. For everyone. The front door opened again, and one of the suited agents stepped out. He spoke briefly with the officer at the top of the porch steps. From the agent's gestures, Frank could tell he wasn't happy. He pointed toward the SUV, toward the cruiser behind it. Then toward the house. The officer folded his arms and shook his head. Disagreement. Jurisdictional friction. Frank knew the signs. Federal and local didn't always see eye to eye, especially when communication broke down. This wasn't a coordinated raid. This was an overlap. Someone had tipped off the city police, and they'd responded without knowing the feds were already involved. That meant confusion. That meant room for error. Another officer moved toward the side of the house, flashlight sweeping across the lawn. Frank pulled deeper into the hedges, staying completely still as the beam passed just inches from his face. The officer turned, said something into his shoulder radio, and moved on. For now, Frank remained invisible. But he couldn't stay that way forever. Inside the house, Adam reappeared near the front window. His silhouette moved closer to Julia. They stood together, still. Neither seemed restrained. No shouting. No struggle. But Frank saw the tension in their bodies, even through the glass. Adam had shifted to a defensive posture, one foot slightly back, like he was bracing for whatever came next. And then the front door opened again. This time, both agents stepped out, one behind the other. Between them stood Adam. Uncuffed. Voluntarily. He looked calm, too calm. Julia followed close behind, eyes darting, face pale. She looked straight past the officers, toward the line of police cars, and then toward the street, scanning the crowd, as if searching for someone. Frank instinctively leaned back into the hedge. He didn't want her to see him, not yet. The lead agent nodded to one of the officers. Words were exchanged. Again, more gestures. Then Adam turned to Julia. He spoke softly, but Frank could read his lips clearly. "It's okay." She tried to respond, but he touched her arm gently, stopping her. Then he stepped forward, placing himself between the agents, and walked toward the black SUV. Frank's hands curled into fists. They weren't dragging him out. He was going with them. Whatever this was, Adam was cooperating. Julia remained on the porch, frozen. One of the agents turned to say something to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes never left Adam. Only when the SUV doors opened did she take a step forward, just one. Then she stopped again. The SUV engine started. Seconds later, it pulled away from the curb, gliding past the cluster of police cars, then turning right at the end of the block. No siren. No lights. Just gone. Frank remained in place, his entire body tense. He had questions, too many, but no way to ask them. James's warning still echoed in his mind, "Do not go back to the house." And yet, watching Julia standing there alone on the porch, watching the officers begin to disperse, he felt a growing pressure in his chest. He needed answers. But the time for direct action hadn't arrived. Not yet. Frank moved silently along the side of the neighbor's yard, back toward the alley that led behind the block. He needed a vantage point. A new plan. Somewhere to regroup. His old Navy friend Cal had a place out in the woods, north of the city. Isolated. Secure. But Frank wasn't ready to run yet. He wanted to know what Adam had gotten himself into. And who had dragged James Monroe back from the dead to warn him. Frank walked with purpose through the narrow back alley that curved behind the rows of suburban homes. He kept close to the fences and moved quickly, eyes scanning every angle. He had no destination in mind beyond the immediate need to vanish from that block without being seen. The lights from the police cruisers were already beginning to fade in the distance behind him. He didn't look back. By the time he reached the far end of the neighborhood, the sirens had gone silent. The normal quiet of the night had returned, but to Frank, it felt like a blanket of false security. The message, the SUV, the agents, the police, all of it had unraveled the illusion of calm in just under an hour. And now, with Adam gone and Julia left behind, Frank was alone in the dark again, chasing the shadow of something bigger than he could yet understand. He crossed a small parking lot and entered a public park that was mostly empty, lit only by the moon and a few flickering lamps. A playground sat deserted, the wind nudging the swings just enough to make them creak. Frank sat on a bench beneath a sycamore tree, shielding himself from view. He took out the flip phone and opened it. No new messages. No missed calls. He tried calling the number that had messaged him earlier, even knowing it was a long shot. The call didn't even ring. Disconnected, he muttered to himself, closing the phone with a click. He remained still for a few minutes, trying to quiet the storm in his mind. James Monroe. The name alone had power. He remembered James as one of the sharpest men he'd ever served with, calm under fire, brilliant in recon strategy, and trusted at a level few others were. That made his sudden reappearance all the more disturbing. If James had faked his death, it hadn't been a small decision. It meant that whatever they had done together in Kuwait had consequences that still hadn't gone away. And if that was the case, then Frank's old life wasn't as far behind him as he had hoped. He needed information. Anything. Even a thread. He pulled a notepad from his jacket, a habit from his Navy days, and scribbled down the timeline of the evening. The message. The agents. The police. The SUV. James's call. Adam's cooperation. He underlined one phrase 3 times. Do not talk to your son. What was James protecting Adam from? The law? Or something else entirely? As he flipped the page, another thought struck him. He hadn't checked his old Navy account in years, the secure line they used during covert operations. It was long since inactive, but in the past, it had served as a back-channel for emergency alerts. He pulled out a small USB stick from the hidden seam of his wallet. The fact that he still carried it, even now, said something about the kind of man Frank was. He never believed the door had fully closed. He walked to the edge of the park and scanned the street for an open business. Across the intersection was a 24-hour laundromat, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Frank crossed quickly, entered, and headed to the back where a public computer kiosk sat unused. He plugged in the drive, accessed the old interface, and entered his credentials, an encrypted passphrase memorized decades ago. To his surprise, the account opened without error. There was only one message waiting. It was text only, timestamped 3 days earlier. One of them is looking for you. Not a test. Get low. No name. No identifier. But the phrasing was unmistakably military. Concise. Directive. And it confirmed something he was already beginning to suspect: his reappearance was not coincidence. Something had been moving in the background before he ever arrived at Adam's house. He disconnected the drive and left immediately, walking a few blocks north before turning down a side street. As he walked, fragments of old memories began to surface. Kuwait, 2003. The dust storms. The border checkpoint. The night raid that never officially happened. Frank had been team lead on a recovery operation that went off the record. A civilian scientist, Dr. Marcus Vey, had gone missing near the demilitarized zone. The government's position was that Vey had been kidnapped by insurgents, but the truth was Messier. Frank's team had orders to retrieve him at all costs, but when they finally reached the bunker, Vey was already dead. What made it worse was that he wasn't killed by insurgents. He was killed by one of their own. James had pulled the trigger, claiming Vey had turned. Said he had been working with foreign operatives, leaking tech data. Frank had buried the report. Buried the body. Buried the entire operation. He'd told himself they'd done the right thing, that Vey's treachery had justified it. But if that night was coming back to haunt them, it meant someone else knew the truth. Someone who hadn't forgotten. Someone who might now be using that event to manipulate Adam. Frank stopped walking. The realization hit like a punch to the ribs. If Adam was being targeted, it wasn't just because of something he did, it might be connected to Frank's past. And if so, then Adam might not even know how deep this went. His phone buzzed again. This time, a different number. He answered it without hesitation. "You're still in the open," the voice said. It wasn't James. It was younger. Faster. "You're being followed. Head east and change your clothes. There's a storage unit at Greenfield and Perry Avenue. Number 18. Inside you'll find a bag. You have 5 minutes." The call ended. Frank didn't waste time. He turned east and ran. By the time he reached the storage complex, the place was silent. A chain-link fence surrounded rows of dull metal units, most of them dark. He found number 18 and opened the lock, which had already been left unlatched. Inside was a duffel bag. He opened it and found a change of clothes, a disposable phone, and a folder. Inside the folder was a single photo: Adam, maybe 7 years old, standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It was old and creased, but on the back, in black ink, was a name. Marcus Vey. June 12. Frank stared at it. The name from Kuwait. The man James had killed. What connection did Adam have to him? Frank stood in the dim light of the unit, the folder in one hand, the photo in the other, and for the first time that night, felt the heavy presence of the past not just knocking, but walking straight through the door. Frank emerged from the storage unit and closed the door quietly behind him. The air outside was damp and heavy, the distant city lights casting a dull orange hue over the skyline. He walked fast toward the edge of the lot, then disappeared into a narrow passage between two buildings, staying away from the main roads. He had changed into the dark jeans and windbreaker found in the duffel bag and left his old clothes inside, along with the burner phone. The folder with the photo he kept tucked tightly inside his jacket. He didn't fully understand the connection yet, why a photo of Adam as a boy would have Marcus Vey's name on the back, or why someone wanted him to see it now. But the direction was clear. Whoever was behind these messages was pointing him back toward the one chapter of his life he had tried the hardest to forget. The consequences of that mission in Kuwait weren't just revisiting him. They were bleeding into Adam's life. That was the one thing Frank couldn't ignore. He reached a quiet intersection and stood beneath a flickering streetlight, scanning for movement. Everything was still. The silence, though, didn't comfort him. He pulled out the new disposable phone and powered it on. No welcome screen. It booted straight to a bare interface with one number preloaded in the contact list. He stared at it for a moment, then pressed call. It rang once. Then again. Click. "I was wondering how long it would take you," said the voice. Frank froze. He recognized it instantly. James. "Not safe to talk long. They'll track this line in less than 90 seconds. Frank's voice was low and cold. "You told me not to get involved. You told me to disappear." "And you didn't," James replied flatly. "You left me a photo of my son as a kid, with Vey's name scribbled on it. You really thought I'd walk away after that?" There was a pause. "I left that so you'd understand what's coming. Not so you'd chase ghosts." "Then help me understand," Frank said sharply. "What's the connection between Adam and Marcus Vey? Why is someone dragging this into the light after 2 decades? Another brief silence. Then James replied, his voice lower. "Because Vey had a son." Frank's breath caught. "No. Vey's family died in a car accident. It was in the report. The report was fake. He had a son, Frank. A secret one. Off the record. Born before the war. That's why Vey went rogue in the first place. He was trying to make sure the boy would be protected." Frank stood motionless under the streetlight. "You're saying Adam?" "No," James said quickly. "Not Adam. But Adam got close to someone who is." Frank's mind reeled. "Who?" "I can't say over this line. But I can tell you this, Adam didn't stumble into this by accident. He was approached. Recruited. Brought into something that ties directly back to Kuwait. He thought he could manage it. But now the situation's changed. You're not making sense, James. You need to go to him," James continued. "Not physically. Not yet. But there's a way to reach him. He left a breadcrumb." Frank glanced around, his instincts flaring again. "You said not to talk to him." "I said don't talk to him directly. But Adam knew there might come a point where you'd get pulled in. He set something up." "What?" "There's a safe deposit box. Baltimore Trust Bank, branch on Park Avenue. Under the name Fletcher Downs. That was our old cover from Cairo, remember?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Yeah. I remember. There's only one key. And you've got it. Inside that old navy ring you always wear." Frank glanced down at his right hand. He hadn't taken off the ring in over 20 years. He'd almost forgotten it was a modified shell casing, something James had custom-made for all of them back in '01. He slipped it off and examined the interior. A small notch, just barely visible. He pressed his thumb against it. A tiny key slid out. "You son of a," Frank muttered. "Told you," James said. "We planned for contingencies." Frank took a slow breath. If Adam set that box up, he knew this might all fall apart. He hoped it wouldn't. But he was smart enough to prepare. A noise in the distance made Frank turn, tires screeching 2 blocks away. James continued, "That's all I can say now. If they find out you're active, they'll connect the dots fast. You need to get to that box. And you need to do it before noon tomorrow." "Why?" "Because after that, they'll lock it down." Click. The line went dead. Frank lowered the phone, his mind racing. He slid the ring back onto his finger, this time with a new weight. The key inside wasn't just a memory from his past, it was now a link to whatever Adam had been involved in. And for Adam to trust that Frank might one day find it, despite their fractured relationship, meant the situation had gone deeper than either of them had ever admitted aloud. He walked briskly now, back toward the main road. He needed transportation. The bank wasn't far, but he wouldn't risk being tracked on foot. The city's surveillance network was too dense. Cameras were everywhere. He cut through a parking lot behind an apartment complex, found a locked maintenance shed, and forced the latch open with a crowbar from a nearby dumpster. Inside was an old black bike, rusted but functional. He took it and rode east, sticking to alleys and side streets, avoiding major intersections. By the time he reached the bank's perimeter hours later, he had memorized every exit route in a 5-block radius. He didn't approach immediately. He waited across the street, hidden behind a maintenance van, watching as the early morning staff entered. At exactly 7 o'clock, the outer doors were unlocked. By 8, the public lobby would be open. He'd have a narrow window. His eyes stayed fixed on the side entrance. He didn't notice the man at first. Mid-30s, jeans, gray hoodie. Standing near a phone booth, pretending to be on a call, but never dialing. Watching the front entrance just like Frank was. Frank's pulse quickened. He wasn't the only one waiting for the bank to open. Someone else was watching for Fletcher Downs. The man in the gray hoodie leaned casually against the phone booth, head slightly bowed as though listening to an invisible caller, but his posture betrayed him. Frank had spent a lifetime reading body language, and this man wasn't relaxed. He was poised. Observant. Waiting. His eyes flicked to every pedestrian who passed near the bank's entrance, not lingering long, but long enough. He was not security. He was hunting. Frank adjusted his stance behind the maintenance van, lowering himself just enough to avoid direct sightlines. He kept his breathing steady, measuring the angles of escape. His first instinct was to leave, get out before the surveillance net tightened. But James's warning about the safe deposit box rang in his mind. If Adam had left something inside it, it was because he knew one day his father might be forced into this very position. And if someone else was watching the same entrance, it meant Adam's foresight had been correct. That box mattered. Frank stayed low and studied the man more closely. Average build, mid-30s, maybe younger. Hands in pockets, but no slouch in his shoulders. Ex-military, Frank guessed. Or at least trained. He moved with too much economy for an ordinary bystander. At one point, the man shifted to check his reflection in the booth glass, and Frank caught the outline of something beneath his hoodie at the waistline. Holster bulge. Definitely armed. The bank lobby opened at 8 sharp. A steady flow of customers entered, professionals with briefcases, an older couple with deposit slips, a young mother carrying a toddler. The man in the hoodie didn't move. He simply adjusted his position, pretending to check his phone now, but his eyes never left the glass doors. Frank decided to test him. He crossed the street, walking at a normal pace, head down as though lost in thought. As he passed near the phone booth, he let his peripheral vision track the man. No sudden movements, but the shift in attention was immediate. The man's weight transferred to the balls of his feet. His right hand twitched ever so slightly, hovering closer to his side. He was ready to react. Not to Frank specifically, but to anyone who might approach the bank under the wrong pretense. Frank didn't break stride. He continued past, rounded the corner, and slipped into a narrow delivery alley. From there, he pulled out the disposable phone and powered it back on. No new messages. He almost called James again, but thought better of it. If James had gone to such lengths to stay in the shadows, another call risked exposure. This he would handle himself. He moved through the alley to the back of the bank. A single security camera covered the service entrance, but Frank knew its blind spot. He'd memorized layouts like this too many times to count. He waited until a delivery truck pulled up and the staff propped the service door open. Then he slipped in with them, his windbreaker making him blend in as another anonymous worker. Inside, the staff hallway smelled of coffee and printer ink. He kept walking, casual, as if he belonged there. At the end of the corridor, he found the stairwell that led down to the safe deposit vault. He paused, pressing his back to the wall, listening. A guard's voice echoed below, speaking with a customer. Timing was crucial. He waited until the conversation ended, then descended quickly. The vault was brightly lit, rows of steel boxes gleaming under fluorescent light. The attendant behind the counter looked up as Frank approached. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Frank said, steady and calm. "Box number 238. Fletcher Downs." The clerk frowned and began typing into a terminal. After a moment, he nodded. "We do have that record. May I see your key?" Frank slid the ring from his finger and carefully produced the hidden key. The clerk inspected it, then handed over a clipboard. "Please sign here." The name on the form was clearly visible, Fletcher Downs. Seeing it written on paper sent a strange shiver down Frank's spine. A ghost from another life, now resurrected in the heart of Baltimore. The clerk unlocked the vault section and guided Frank to the small private room. "Take as long as you need, sir. When you're done, just let me know." Frank nodded and closed the door behind him. Alone now, he slid the key into the lock and turned it. The box opened with a smooth metallic click. Inside were two items. The first was a sealed envelope. The second was a flash drive. Frank took the envelope first. His name was written across the front in Adam's handwriting. His throat tightened. He unfolded the paper inside. "Dad. If you're reading this, then things didn't go as planned. I never wanted you involved, but I knew they'd find me eventually. I've been working with people I can't fully trust, and I didn't want to risk your life if it went wrong. There's information on the drive that explains everything. Don't give it to anyone until you're sure who they work for. If you see James, be careful. He isn't the same man you remember. Adam." Frank lowered the letter slowly. His son's words cut deeper than he expected. The secrecy. The foresight. The fact that Adam anticipated not only danger but betrayal. And the reference to James, warning Frank against the very man who had just called him with instructions. It confirmed Frank's unease. James might have once been his brother in arms, but the man on the other end of that phone was playing his own game now. He picked up the flash drive. Plain black, unmarked. He slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then came the sound. A faint creak. A footstep in the hallway outside the vault room. Frank froze. Another step. Closer this time. He slipped the box back into its slot, locked it, and pocketed the key. Moving silently, he positioned himself behind the door. His pulse slowed, his body coiled like a spring. The doorknob turned. The man in the gray hoodie stepped inside. He wasn't surprised. His eyes moved straight to the table, then to Frank. For a second, both men were still. Then the intruder reached for his waistband. Frank struck first. His fist drove upward into the man's wrist, knocking the weapon loose before it cleared the holster. The gun clattered across the floor. The man swung back with his free hand, but Frank caught his arm, twisted hard, and slammed him against the wall. The impact shook the narrow room. "Who sent you?" Frank growled. The man spat blood from his lip. "You're too late. He already made his choice." "What choice?" Frank pressed harder, twisting the man's arm until he winced. "You'll find out soon enough," the man hissed. Frank shoved him harder against the wall, but before he could press further, the clerk's voice called from down the hall. "Everything all right in there, sir?" The momentary distraction was all it took. The man shifted his weight, kicked backward into Frank's knee, and broke free. He bolted through the doorway, sprinting down the hall. Frank didn't chase. Not yet. He stooped, grabbed the dropped pistol, and tucked it under his jacket. Then he straightened the table, composed himself, and opened the door casually. The clerk glanced up from his desk. "All set, sir?" "Yes," Frank said evenly. "All set." He walked out calmly, but inside, his thoughts burned. Adam had left him a warning. James might no longer be trustworthy. And now someone else knew exactly what Frank had come for. Whatever Adam had hidden on that drive, it wasn't just dangerous, it was the reason everyone was circling closer. And Frank could no longer deny it. His son had been keeping secrets that stretched far beyond his understanding. Frank left the bank through the side exit, walking with the steady, composed pace of a man who belonged exactly where he was. But the weight of what he carried in his jacket pocket was heavier than steel. The flash drive pressed against his chest, the letters folded paper still warm from his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to open it immediately, to see what Adam had risked so much to leave behind. Yet he also knew better. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The morning crowd had thickened. Commuters rushed past with coffee cups, students carried backpacks across the crosswalk, delivery trucks honked as they tried to maneuver in the tight street. The city was alive, oblivious. But Frank walked through it like a ghost. Every glance over his shoulder was calculated, every reflection in the glass storefronts checked for a tail. He didn't see the man in the hoodie again, but that didn't ease the tension. He knew better than to think the threat had disappeared just because it was momentarily out of sight. He turned into an alley and found the rusted bike he had stashed earlier. Mounting it, he pedaled toward the quieter part of the city, weaving through traffic until the streets thinned. His destination wasn't chosen by instinct alone. He needed somewhere secure, away from prying eyes, where he could examine the contents of the flash drive. Only one name came to mind, Cal Richards. Cal had been his closest friend since the Navy. A mechanic by trade, Cal now lived in a converted warehouse north of the city, far enough from government reach to matter but close enough for emergencies. Frank hadn't planned to involve him. But given what was unfolding, he no longer had the luxury of handling it all alone. By the time he reached Cal's warehouse, the sky had clouded over, gray shadows swallowing the morning sun. Frank knocked twice on the steel door, then once more after a pause. The sound echoed through the cavernous building. Moments later, the door opened and a tall, broad man with a thick beard appeared, wiping grease from his hands. "Jesus, Frank. It's been a while." Cal's voice was rough but warm, tinged with surprise. "What the hell are you doing here? Can I come in?" Frank asked. His tone left little room for small talk. Cal studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Yeah. You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank stepped into the warehouse. The place smelled of motor oil and old wood. Rows of classic cars in various stages of repair filled the floor. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and a battered couch sat near a space heater in the corner. It was the kind of place only someone like Cal could live, isolated, practical, and untouchable. "You're not here for nostalgia," Cal said, tossing the grease rag onto a workbench. "What's going on?" Frank sat down heavily on the couch, pulling the letter from his pocket. He handed it over. Cal read it, his brow furrowing. "Your kid left you this?" "Yes. And a drive." Frank pulled the small black flash drive from his jacket and set it on the table. Cal whistled low. "Looks like you walked into something messy." "I didn't walk in," Frank said sharply. "I was dragged in. And Adam, he's in deeper than I ever realized." Cal sat across from him. "You want to see what's on it?" Frank nodded once. Cal went to the workbench and grabbed a battered laptop, its casing dented but functional. He powered it on, disconnected from any network, and slid the drive into the port. The screen flickered, then loaded a folder structure. Dozens of files appeared, documents, photos, encrypted archives. Cal clicked on the first video file. The footage showed a dimly lit room, Adam sitting at a table across from a man whose face was obscured. Adam's voice was clear. "They don't know I'm recording this. I'm leaving this for my father in case I disappear. The operation isn't what they told us. The people I'm working with, they're not all government. Some are contractors. Some are former military. And some, I don't even know who they're aligned with." Frank leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. Adam continued, his tone tense. "It started as surveillance, cyber tracking, financial tracing. But then I saw the transfers. Millions moving through shell accounts tied back to old defense contracts. Someone is funneling money to groups overseas, using the cover of security programs. And the worst part is, it's tied to the mission my father was on. The one in Kuwait." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Adam leaned closer to the camera. "Dad, if you're watching this, it means I couldn't protect you from it. They'll use what happened back then as leverage. Don't trust James. He's part of it now. I don't know why, but he's playing both sides." The video cut off abruptly. Cal exhaled slowly. "Well, that's not the kind of thing you leave lying around." Frank sat back, silent. His son had uncovered corruption at a scale he hadn't imagined, money laundering, covert funding, ties to the very mission that had haunted Frank for years. And James, his old comrade, was implicated. Not just as a survivor, but as a player. "This puts you in an impossible spot," Cal said finally. "If you protect Adam, you're shielding him from the feds. If you hand this over, you burn him, and yourself." Frank rubbed his temples. The dilemma weighed heavy. His duty as a former officer demanded loyalty to truth, to justice. But his blood demanded something else entirely. He had spent his life protecting Adam from the shadows of his past. Could he now betray him, even if the law demanded it? Before he could answer, Cal's phone buzzed on the workbench. He glanced at it, frowned, then picked it up. "It's Julia," Cal said, surprised. "Your daughter-in-law. How the hell does she have my number?" Frank stood sharply. "Put her on speaker." Cal did. Julia's voice came through, shaky but determined. "Cal? It's Julia. I know Frank's with you." Frank stepped closer. "Julia, I'm here." Her breath caught. "Thank God. I didn't know where else to call. They took Adam. They said it was for questioning, but it's been hours. No one will tell me anything. Not the police, not the agents. The house is being watched." "Frank, what's happening?" Frank closed his eyes briefly, then answered. "Julia, listen to me. You're in danger too. Whatever Adam was involved in, it's bigger than you think. Don't trust anyone who comes to the door. Stay inside. Lock everything." "I don't understand," Julia's voice cracked. "Danger from who?" "From people who don't care whether Adam lives or dies," Frank said grimly. "Or whether you do." There was silence on the line. Then Julia whispered, "What should I do?" Frank opened his eyes, his decision already forming. "Pack a small bag. Essentials only. Leave the house in the next 30 minutes. Take the old highway toward Cal's. Don't tell anyone where you're going. And Julia, don't bring your phone. Leave it behind." "I don't know if I can." "You can," Frank cut her off firmly. "And you will. It's the only way you'll be safe." The line went quiet again, then Julia whispered, "Okay. I'll do it." The call ended. Cal leaned back in his chair. "You just dragged her into the storm." "She was already in it," Frank replied, his voice heavy. He glanced at the drive again, then at the letter. "The only question now is whether I protect Adam by hiding the truth, or whether I protect him by bringing it all into the light. Cal watched him. And which way are you leaning? Frank didn't answer. His dilemma was growing heavier by the hour. Because whichever path he chose, someone he loved would pay the price. Julia did exactly as Frank instructed. By the time the evening shadows lengthened across Baltimore streets, she was already behind the wheel of her aging sedan, a small overnight bag in the passenger seat, her phone left behind on the kitchen counter. Her knuckles gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove, her eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror. The familiar city she'd lived in for years no longer felt like home, it felt like a maze of traps where every set of headlights behind her might conceal danger. Frank had wanted her safe, but Julia couldn't stop the questions running through her mind. What had Adam done? Why had the police come for him in the first place? And why was Frank, stern, disciplined, always so sure of himself, now suddenly living like a fugitive? She trusted her father-in-law, but the silence around her husband's arrest gnawed at her. She needed answers. Answers Frank still wasn't giving. Meanwhile, Frank sat with Cal in the warehouse, staring at the darkened laptop screen. The video of Adam still echoed in his thoughts, the words repeating in a loop, "Don't trust James. They'll use Kuwait against you." His son hadn't only uncovered corruption, he had anticipated betrayal. The silence in the warehouse pressed heavier by the minute. Cal busied himself by adjusting tools on the bench, but Frank knew he was giving him space to think. His friend had always known when to speak and when to keep quiet. Finally, Frank broke the silence. If Julia makes it here, she'll bring more eyes with her. They'll be tracking the house, waiting to see who she contacts, where she goes. She's smart, but she doesn't have our training. Cal nodded. Which means the minute she shows up, we'll be on someone's radar. Frank rubbed his temples. We already are. Adam was right. This isn't just federal investigation. There are contractors involved. And contractors don't play by rules. Cal frowned. What's on that drive could sink a lot of powerful people. That makes you and your family high-value targets. The kind they don't leave loose ends on. Frank leaned back in his chair, his eyes hardening. That's why I can't decide whether silence protects Adam or destroys him. If I turn this over, it could blow the lid off everything, but it could also paint him as part of it. Before Cal could answer, the warehouse phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the stillness like a blade. Frank and Cal exchanged a glance. Very few people had this number. Cal picked it up, cautious. Yeah? There was a pause. Then his expression changed, and he handed the receiver to Frank. It's for you. Frank pressed it to his ear. Who is this? The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate. Mr. Caldwell, you don't know me. But I know about Kuwait. And I know about your son. Frank stiffened. If you know about Kuwait, then you already know this isn't a conversation you want to have over the phone. The voice chuckled softly. That's where you're wrong. This is exactly the kind of conversation we have over the phone. Anonymous. Untraceable. Direct. I'm calling because I want you to understand something. Adam is alive, but he won't stay that way unless you stay quiet. Hand over whatever he left for you, and he'll live. Resist, and you'll bury him. Frank's jaw tightened. If you're so sure I have something, then you already know I'm not handing it over to a voice in the dark. You don't have to, the man said. We'll find you soon enough. But consider this a courtesy call. A chance to make the right choice before things get messy. Ask yourself, Frank, how many more people around you need to get hurt before you stop pretending you're in control? The line went dead. Frank lowered the receiver slowly. His face was unreadable, but inside, his blood ran cold. Whoever that man was, he wasn't bluffing. They knew. They were already closing in. Cal watched him carefully. What did he say? That Adam's life depends on my silence, Frank replied. And that I won't be the only one who pays if I resist. Cal exhaled sharply. They'll use Julia. You know that, don't you? Frank nodded. He knew it all too well. The sound of tires outside broke their conversation. Both men froze, listening. A car door slammed. Then another. Frank moved quickly to the window, parting the blinds just enough to see outside. A dark sedan had pulled up to the curb. Two figures stepped out, dressed in plain clothes, their movements purposeful. They weren't neighbors. They weren't delivery men. They were here for something, or someone. Julia? Cal asked quietly. Frank shook his head. No. Too soon. The figures approached the warehouse door. One reached for the handle. Frank gestured sharply to Cal. They moved silently into position, Cal grabbing a wrench from the bench, Frank drawing the pistol he had taken from the man in the bank vault. The door rattled once, then swung open. The first man stepped inside, scanning the dim interior. His partner followed close behind. Frank Caldwell, the first man, called out. We know you're here. Let's make this simple. Come with us, and no one has to get hurt. Frank didn't move from the shadows. You want me, you come and take me. The man sighed as though disappointed. That's the old Navy pride talking. But you're not a soldier anymore, Frank. You're just a liability. Cal stepped forward suddenly, wrench raised. The intruder swung toward him, but Frank fired a single shot into the concrete floor between the man's boots. The sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. Next one's not a warning, Frank growled. The men froze. A tense silence filled the space. Finally, the first man raised his hand slightly. We're not here to fight. We're here to deliver a message. Frank kept his gun steady. Then deliver it. The man's eyes narrowed. You have 48 hours to decide. Hand over what your son left you, or Julia will be the one we come for next. He backed toward the door slowly, his partner following. They slipped out into the night, the sound of their car starting up seconds later. Cal exhaled. They're tightening the noose, Frank. Frank lowered the pistol, his jaw set like stone. Then it's time I stopped waiting for their moves and started making my own. The silence that followed wasn't protective anymore. It was suffocating, dangerous, and full of the weight of lives hanging in the balance. Frank had always believed silence was strength. But now, silence was a weapon in someone else's hands. And it was about to hurt the people he loved most. The warehouse felt heavier after the intruders left, the echo of their footsteps still hanging in the air. Frank remained by the window, staring at the empty street, his hand tightening around the pistol until his knuckles turned pale. He could still hear the man's words, 48 hours, Julia's name used as leverage. That was no idle threat. They knew exactly how to wound him, how to drag him into submission. Cal walked over, voice low but firm. They'll be back. Probably with more men. We can't stay here. Frank nodded slowly. He knew Cal was right. Yet leaving meant moving Julia as well. And she was already vulnerable, already in motion. The thought of her driving those dark highways alone gnawed at him, especially knowing she was a target now. But before Frank could form a plan, something strange interrupted his thoughts. A metallic clink against the warehouse door. Then silence. Both men froze. Cal reached for the nearest tool, a heavy crowbar, and gestured to Frank. They moved in tandem toward the door. Frank eased it open just enough to see outside. Nothing but the still night. Then he looked down. On the concrete lay a plain manila envelope. No markings, no postage, just dropped there deliberately. Frank grabbed it and closed the door quickly. He carried it to the workbench, laying it flat beneath the single hanging bulb. Cal hovered beside him, tension etched across his face. Could be a trap, Cal muttered. Frank carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It was Adam, no more than 7 years old, standing in front of their old house in Norfolk, grinning with a baseball glove too large for his hand. But it wasn't the image itself that chilled Frank. On the back, written in faded black ink, was a name. Marcus Vey. And beneath it, a date, June 12, 2003. Frank's stomach clenched. The date wasn't random. It was the night of the mission in Kuwait, the night Dr. Marcus Vey had died by James Monroe's hand. Cal read the back, then looked up sharply. Why the hell would someone connect Adam to Vey? He was a kid. Thousands of miles away. This doesn't make sense. But Frank knew better. Memories, long buried, began clawing their way back into his mind. The mission hadn't just been about retrieving a missing scientist. It had been about secrets Vey was carrying, secrets about experimental defense technology and classified transfers. The official story was that Vey had defected, but Frank had never been certain. He remembered James insisting that Vey couldn't be trusted. He remembered the shot. He remembered covering it up. And now, someone was linking his son to that same man. Frank gripped the photo tightly. This isn't about Adam. Not directly. This is about me. About what we buried that night. Cal shook his head. Then why leave this now? Why bring Adam into it at all? Frank thought for a long moment. Because Adam stumbled too close. He dug into something that traces back to Vey, and they're using it to pull me out of hiding. They want me to carry the weight of it, not just him. Before Cal could respond, Frank's phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a text. You're running out of time. The truth will surface, with or without you. Attached was a single file. Frank opened it cautiously. It was a scanned page from a classified report, one he had thought destroyed. His blood ran cold as he read the header. Operation Resolute Dawn, Debrief, June 13, 2003. And beneath it, his own signature. Cal leaned closer. They've got your file. Frank nodded grimly. Not just mine. This is the original. The one I falsified after James pulled the trigger. He remembered it vividly now. Vey hadn't been resisting when James shot him. He had been pleading, trying to explain something. Frank had redacted the details, writing the report to state that Vey had attempted to attack them, leaving James no choice. It had been cleaner, simpler. Necessary, or so he thought at the time. But it had been a lie. A lie that someone had kept all these years. Cal's voice broke through his thoughts. Frank, if they leak that, your name's finished. They'll brand you a traitor. Adam too, just for being your son. Frank's jaw tightened. That's the point. They're not after justice. They're after control. The warehouse phone rang again, the sound sharp and jarring. Frank grabbed it, his voice cold. Talk. A familiar voice answered. James Monroe. You've got the envelope, haven't you? Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. So this is your game. You don't understand, James said quickly. I didn't send it. I've been trying to stop them from digging it up. But someone inside the circle wants you exposed. They think breaking you will break Adam. Frank's voice was steady. Then tell me who they are. James hesitated. If I tell you over this line, we're both dead by morning. Just know this, Vey's work didn't die with him. Pieces of it survived. And Adam found one. That's why they want him. What pieces? Frank demanded. Not over the phone, James said. But think about it, why would a scientist risk everything, defect, and run into enemy territory unless what he was carrying was bigger than himself? He wasn't betraying the country, Frank. He was trying to keep something from the people inside it. The line went dead again. Frank slammed the receiver down, anger boiling inside him. He turned to Cal. They've been playing me from the start. Vey wasn't the traitor. We were. Cal's eyes narrowed. No, Frank. Not you. Not Adam. But James, maybe. Frank didn't answer. He just looked at the photo of his son, the name scrawled across the back like a curse, and realized the past wasn't just haunting him anymore. It was coming for his family. And if he didn't uncover the full truth of what had really happened that night in Kuwait, Adam would pay for a crime that wasn't his to bear. The photograph lay on the table like a wound that would not close. Adam's childhood smile seemed grotesquely out of place when paired with the scrawled name of Marcus Vey on its reverse. Frank's eyes kept returning to it, tracing every crease and faded edge, as though some hidden truth might reveal itself if he stared long enough. But he knew there was only one way forward now. The past could no longer be hidden, it had to be confronted. Cal stood across the room, his arms folded tightly, watching Frank with the wary patience of a man who had seen too many storms gather before. "You can't hold this much longer, Frank. The weight will crush you. You've got to make a move." Frank finally looked up. His voice was steady, but beneath it was the rumble of old rage. "Then I'll make one. Not in the shadows, not through back channels. Direct. I want to know who's orchestrating this and what they want from Adam. And the only way to find out is to confront them head-on." Cal frowned. "And how do you plan to do that? You can't just walk into the federal building and start confessing to things you buried 20 years ago." "No," Frank admitted. "But I can find someone who knows both sides. Someone who has the clearance and the incentive to talk. Someone James would never expect me to approach." Cal tilted his head. "And you've got someone in mind, don't you?" Frank nodded. "Karen Dwyer. She was with the Department of Defense during Resolute Dawn. She signed off on the post-op logistics. She'll know what was scrubbed, what was altered, and who benefited from burying the truth." Cal let out a low whistle. "If she's still in government, she won't risk talking. If she's retired, she'll be watched." "Exactly," Frank said grimly. "Which is why I need leverage. And I've got it." He tapped the flash drive in his pocket. "Adam's files. The proof that the money laundering ties back to defense contracts. If I show her I know enough to hurt people, she'll talk. Because she won't want me taking this public without context." Cal shook his head slowly. "Frank, this is dangerous. One wrong move and you're not protecting Adam, you're handing him over." Frank met his friend's gaze. "There's no safe road anymore. Only the one that gives us answers before they bury him alive." By mid-afternoon, Frank was already in the city, moving like a ghost through crowds and side streets. He'd swapped cars twice, once by borrowing Cal's old pickup and then abandoning it for a bus route that carried him deeper into downtown. He traveled light, the flash drive, the photo, the pistol concealed beneath his jacket. His ring with the hidden key remained on his finger, a reminder of the past he could no longer deny. Karen Dwyer lived in a brownstone not far from the harbor. She had retired 5 years earlier, after decades in defense intelligence, and was known among old circles as someone who had seen too much but said too little. Frank respected her for that silence, but today, silence was no longer an option. He approached her house cautiously. A black sedan was parked across the street, 2 men inside pretending to read newspapers. Surveillance. Federal or private, Frank couldn't tell yet. But it confirmed his suspicion: Karen was still under watch. He circled around, cutting through the alley, and reached the back entrance. The yard was small, cluttered with old garden tools and a rusted swing set. Frank picked the lock in seconds and slipped inside. Karen was in the kitchen, her back to him, pouring tea into a chipped mug. She didn't flinch when he entered. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said without turning. Her voice was calm, measured. Frank froze. "You knew I'd come?" She turned then, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her sharp eyes still carrying the weight of decades in the service. She looked older, yes, but not fragile. She carried herself like someone who had waited for this moment. "You've been a ghost for 20 years, Caldwell. But when the files started resurfacing, I knew you wouldn't stay buried forever." Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They've got Adam. My son. And they're using Kuwait as leverage." Karen's eyes softened slightly. Then it's worse than I thought. She gestured to the table. Sit. Frank obeyed, though his instinct screamed not to linger. I need to know the truth, Karen. The full truth. What was Vay carrying that night, and why did James kill him? Karen sat across from him, her hands folded. Marcus Vay wasn't a traitor. He was a whistleblower. He discovered that a network inside the department was diverting defense funds through dummy contracts. Billions meant for reconstruction and security were funneled into private accounts. He had evidence. He was trying to extract himself before they silenced him. Frank's pulse quickened. Then James. James was compromised, Karen said flatly. He was approached before your team deployed. Promised money, protection, maybe even power. His job wasn't to retrieve Vay, it was to erase him. And when you buried the truth in your report, Frank, you became part of the cover-up, whether you knew it or not. Frank felt the old guilt rise, hot and sharp in his chest. So all these years, I was protecting the wrong side. Karen nodded. And now Adam stumbled into the modern version of it. The same network. Same money flows. Different faces. Frank leaned forward, his voice like steel. Then tell me who runs it now. Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking to the window. If I say the name, you won't live long enough to use it. Frank slammed the flash drive on the table. Adam left this for me. He wanted me to know. If I'm already marked, then I don't care about living long. I care about saving my son. Karen's eyes lingered on the drive. Finally, she whispered, the man you need is Victor Hale. Former general. Now a contractor. He runs most of the overseas cyber operations. James reports to him. Always has. Frank absorbed the name. Hale. A ghost from his own past, a commander known for ruthlessness even among hardened men. If he was behind this, it explained everything. Before Frank could speak again, movement outside caught his eye. The sedan's doors opened. The two watchers were coming up the walk. Karen's eyes widened. You were followed. Frank stood, pocketing the drive. Then we confront them. Karen rose too, but there was fear in her eyes. Frank, these aren't men you can scare with a pistol. They've been waiting for this confrontation longer than you have. Frank steadied his breath, the old steel settling back into his bones. Then let's see if they've been waiting for me. The knock on the door came hard and fast. And Frank knew, the time for hiding was over. The knock rattled the brownstone's wooden frame, a sound too sharp, too deliberate to be anything but hostile. Karen's eyes locked on Frank's, silently asking if he was ready. He gave a single nod, and together they moved into position. Karen slipped toward the back hallway, retrieving something from a locked cabinet, a revolver wrapped in cloth, while Frank stayed near the kitchen entry, his pistol trained at the front. The knock came again, louder this time. Karen Dwyer, a voice called out. Calm, professional, but with a subtle edge of authority. We need to speak with you. This is federal business. Karen stiffened. She mouthed to Frank, not federal. He already knew. Real federal agents didn't announce themselves like that, not with surveillance already in place. These were operatives under Hale's command, sent to clean up loose ends. And Karen was one of the biggest loose ends still breathing. The doorknob twisted. The lock resisted for a moment, then clicked open. Two men entered, both in suits without ties, moving with the precision of trained muscle. The first scanned the living room while the second stepped into the kitchen threshold. That was his mistake. Frank moved from the shadow and pressed the barrel of his pistol against the man's temple before he had time to react. Hands up, Frank ordered. The first man froze, his hand hovering near his jacket. Karen appeared from the hallway, her revolver leveled at him. This house is private property, she said coldly. And you're trespassing. The men exchanged a glance, then slowly raised their hands. But their faces carried no fear, only the thin smirk of men who believed the outcome was already decided. "You're making this harder than it has to be," the first one said. "General Hale wants a conversation, that's all." Frank's grip tightened. "Hale can send his own voice if he wants to talk. You don't walk into a woman's house uninvited." The second man turned his head slightly, despite the gun pressed to it. "Caldwell. He said you'd be stubborn." Hearing his name unsettled Frank more than he let show. They weren't guessing. They knew exactly who he was, and exactly why he was here. "Then he also knows I don't negotiate with ghosts," Frank growled. "Tell him if he wants me, he can come himself." The men stayed silent, then one of them smiled faintly. "We don't need you, Caldwell. We already have your son." The words hit like a hammer. Frank shoved the man forward, his fury barely contained. "Where is he?" Neither answered. Their smirks remained fixed, practiced, designed to bait him into mistakes. Karen shifted slightly, her revolver steady. "Frank. Not here. They're baiting you." Frank forced himself to breathe, to steady the boiling anger in his chest. He lowered his pistol an inch, just enough to keep control without pulling the trigger out of rage. "You tell Hale this," Frank said finally, his voice a low growl. "If Adam comes back hurt, I burn everything. Every file, every report, every secret you've all tried to bury. You know I can. You know I will." The two men exchanged another glance. Then, almost simultaneously, they lowered their arms and backed toward the door. They weren't retreating out of fear, they were withdrawing because their message had been delivered. The door shut behind them, and silence filled the house again. Karen exhaled slowly. That was close. Frank holstered his weapon, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "They wanted me to know Adam's alive. That was deliberate. They want me chasing him instead of exposing them." Karen nodded. "Classic misdirection. Keep you emotional, keep you distracted." Frank paced the room. "Except Adam knew I'd be pulled in. He left the drive for me, he left the letter. He wanted me to discover the truth. But there's something else. Something he didn't say outright." Karen tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Frank pulled the flash drive back out, turning it over in his hand. "Adam warned me not to trust James. He knew James was compromised. But he never said why he trusted me to carry this, when he could have given it to the authorities himself. He wasn't just protecting me. He was protecting Julia. And that means whatever he was involved in, he wasn't only undercover, he was working both sides." Karen's eyes widened slightly. "You think Adam was embedded in Hale's network?" Frank nodded slowly. "Not as a follower. As a mole. He had to make Hale believe he was one of them. That's why he looked calm when they took him. He wasn't being arrested. He was being repositioned." Karen's face grew pale. "If that's true, then Adam's deeper than even you realized. He's part of an operation you don't control. And if Hale discovers his betrayal..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Frank gripped the back of a chair, steadying himself. "That's why Adam never told me. Because the less I knew, the longer he could keep playing his role. He carried the silence so I wouldn't have to." Karen's expression softened for a moment, her stern demeanor giving way to something more human. "Then your son is braver than most soldiers I've ever known." Before Frank could reply, Karen's landline phone rang. Both of them froze. She walked cautiously to the table and answered it, putting it on speaker. A familiar voice filled the room. "Dad?" Frank's chest tightened. It was Adam. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with exhaustion. "Adam," Frank said, his voice cracking against his will. "Where are you?" "I don't have long," Adam said quickly. "I can't tell you where. Just know I'm safe, for now." "But Dad, you can't trust anyone outside that house. Not even James. Especially not James." Hale's watching him. Frank leaned closer to the phone. Listen to me, son. I have the drive. I've seen part of what you left. I know you've been working both sides. Silence. Then Adam exhaled slowly. So you figured it out? Why didn't you tell me? Frank demanded. Because I couldn't, Adam replied. If you knew, they would have used you against me. I needed you in the dark. But now that you're involved, you have to finish it. Don't give Hale what he wants. Use the files. Expose them. Frank's voice hardened. Where are they keeping you? I can't say. But I'm not a prisoner, Dad. Not yet. I'm still in the operation. Still pretending. But the walls are closing in, and I don't know how much longer I can hold them off. Then get out, Frank urged. Come to me. We'll fight this together. I can't, Adam said firmly. If I leave now, everything I've built, everything I've learned, it'll vanish. Hale will cover his tracks and disappear again. We'll never get another chance. Frank's throat tightened. His son's voice carried the same resolve Frank once had in his own youth, the voice of a man willing to sacrifice everything for a mission greater than himself. I learned this from you, Dad, Adam said softly. Protecting people. Carrying the weight alone. But I can't carry it much longer. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. Promise me you'll finish it. The line clicked dead before Frank could answer. Silence filled the room, heavier than any before. Karen whispered, Your son isn't just in the middle of this, Frank. He's the key to it. And that makes him the most dangerous piece on the board. Frank closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed fire. No, he said. That makes him the most valuable. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Frank realized the truth. Adam hadn't just been hiding from him. He had been protecting him. Frank sat in Karen's kitchen long after the call ended, staring at the silent receiver as if his son's voice might return if he willed it hard enough. The words Adam had spoken replayed in his mind on a loop, I'm not a prisoner. Not yet. But the walls are closing in. His son was walking a tightrope above an abyss, and Frank felt powerless to catch him if he fell. Karen poured 2 cups of tea, setting one near Frank though he barely touched it. You realize what that call meant, she said finally. He's still in control, but only barely. When men get that tone, resigned, steady, but already preparing for the worst, it means they know the mission may end with them not walking away. Frank's jaw clenched. He's not dying for Hale's secrets. Not after all this. I didn't carry silence for 20 years just to watch my son become another casualty of the past. Karen studied him carefully. Then you'll need help. Real help. Not Cal, not me. Someone inside the system who still has enough power to protect him and expose Hale at the same time. Frank thought for a long moment. Names from the past flickered through his mind, but trust was a rare currency. Most of the men he had once relied on were either buried or compromised. But one face surfaced, an agent from military intelligence who had been sidelined for pushing too hard against corruption. Someone stubborn enough not to bend. Agent Monroe Carter, Frank said at last. Karen's brow lifted. Carter? I thought he retired after the Pentagon hearings. He did, Frank replied. But retirement for men like him doesn't mean disappearance. He has his own network. And if anyone can find where Adam's being held, it's Carter. Karen hesitated. Contacting him means stepping fully back into the open. You'll have no cover. I lost my cover the moment Adam left me that drive, Frank said firmly. By the time night fell, Frank and Karen had moved to a safer location, a safe house Carter had arranged years earlier for emergencies. It was an abandoned print shop on the outskirts of the city, with heavy shutters and a reinforced basement. Frank found a dusty rotary phone hidden in a drawer and dialed the coded number he hadn't used in over a decade. The line clicked once, then again. A gravelly voice answered. Carter. Frank straightened. It's Caldwell. There was a pause. Then a low chuckle. I'll be damned. The ghost himself. You picking up the phone means one thing, you're drowning. Frank's voice was cold. Not drowning. Fighting. And I need your help. Go on. It's Victor Hale, Frank said. He's running an operation tied to defense funds, contractors, cyber networks. Adam, my son, went undercover. He's deep inside it. They've got him now, and I don't know how long he can hold out. Carter exhaled slowly. I knew Hale was dirty, but you just confirmed more than I could have hoped for. If your boy's on the inside, he's sitting on gold. But it also means he's a target. I need to see him, Frank said. I need to bring him out. That's not how this works, Carter replied. You can't storm Hale's fortress with a sidearm and fatherly rage. But, there's a way. Frank waited, his grip on the phone tightening. There's a transfer happening tomorrow night, Carter continued. A decoy operation Hale set up to test loyalty among his recruits. They're moving encrypted servers from a warehouse near the harbor. Adam will be there. If he's still playing his role, he'll be in the convoy. Frank's pulse quickened. Then I'll intercept it. No, Carter said sharply. If you intervene, you'll blow his cover and probably get him killed. But if you shadow the operation, you'll see where they take him after. That's when you'll have your window. Frank closed his eyes briefly. The waiting would be torture, but Carter was right. This wasn't about storming in blindly. It was about precision. The next evening, Frank and Carter positioned themselves near the harbor, hidden in the skeletal remains of an old shipping yard. Through binoculars, Frank watched the warehouse gates. Black vans lined up, men moving crates under dim floodlights. And then he saw him. Adam. His son stepped out from one of the vans, dressed like the others in tactical gear, his face stoic. To anyone else, he looked like just another soldier in Hale's army. But to Frank, he looked like the boy he once taught to throw a baseball, now carrying the burden of a war that wasn't his to fight. Frank's throat tightened. He wanted to call out, to run to him, to pull him away from all of it. But he forced himself still. Carter's hand on his shoulder anchored him. Patience. Watch. The convoy rolled out, 6 black vans heading north. Frank and Carter followed at a distance in an unmarked sedan, lights off, keeping to the shadows of the industrial district. The vans moved with military precision, turning down a stretch of road that led into a secure facility, a building reinforced with fencing and cameras. Hale's compound. Frank's chest burned. His son had walked willingly into the lion's den. Hours later, after the convoy disappeared inside, Carter pulled the car into an abandoned lot. He turned to Frank. Now you know. That's where they've got him. And if we're going to pull him out alive, we'll need more than guts. We'll need strategy. Frank didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the compound silhouette in the distance. But inside, something stirred. For the first time in years, father and son were in the same fight, bound not just by blood but by the same mission. And Frank knew the reconnection he thought impossible was no longer a dream. It was real, fragile, and waiting inside those walls. He would get his son back. Or he would die trying. The compound loomed in the distance, its perimeter lined with tall fences, razor wire glinting under floodlights. Watchtowers stood like silent sentinels, and cameras swept back and forth in mechanical arcs. From the shadows of the abandoned lot, Frank studied every movement, memorizing the guards' rotations, the timing of the gates, the intervals between patrols. He wasn't just looking for weaknesses, he was thinking like he used to, like a soldier planning an infiltration. Beside him, Carter scribbled notes in a worn notebook, his voice low. They're running this like a military base, but with private resources. No insignias, no accountability. Everything Hale touches turns into his own kingdom. Frank didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the interior courtyard, where a group of men moved between the vans that had just arrived. He caught sight of Adam again, unloading crates with the others. He moved with the same practiced efficiency as those around him, but Frank could see the subtle differences, the hesitation before he set down a box, the way his eyes flicked toward the cameras as if calculating their blind spots. Adam wasn't just another recruit. He was watching, memorizing, preparing. Frank's chest tightened. He wanted to run to him, to shout his name, but he forced himself into stillness. The mission wasn't rescue yet. It was survival. Carter finally spoke again. "We'll need evidence strong enough to shut Hale down. The drive you've got is a start, but it's not enough. We need physical proof from inside that compound. Bank records, encrypted logs, contracts, anything that ties Hale's network directly to the money laundering." Frank's gaze didn't shift from Adam. "And my son?" Carter nodded. "And your son?" The hours stretched into night. They observed quietly, cataloging shifts, guard positions, entry points. At 2 in the morning, the compound settled into its nighttime rhythm, fewer men outside, heavier reliance on cameras. Carter tapped the notebook. "That's your window. If you want to get him, it's then." Frank's hand tightened around the pistol concealed in his jacket. "Then that's when I go." Carter raised an eyebrow. "We go. You're not storming Hale's stronghold alone, Caldwell. If we're pulling this off, we're pulling it off together." Frank allowed himself the faintest of nods. He wasn't used to relying on others anymore, but he knew this was bigger than him. Bigger even than Adam. The following night, the plan was set. Carter provided disguises, maintenance uniforms stolen from a contractor's depot. Frank felt strange pulling one on, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar, but it gave him cover. Together, they approached the compound service entrance, timing their movement between patrols. The gate was guarded by a single man who barely glanced at them before waving them through. The uniforms worked. Once inside, the scale of the compound became clearer. It wasn't just a warehouse, it was a hub. Rows of servers hummed in a secure building at the center, while armed men patrolled dormitories and training grounds. Frank moved with purpose, his eyes scanning for Adam. He spotted him at last, walking alone across the yard toward the server building. Frank's pulse quickened, but he didn't break formation. Not yet. They entered the server building through a side door. The air inside was cold, filled with the constant whir of machines. Racks of servers blinked with green and red lights, endless streams of data flowing through them. Carter pulled a small device from his pocket and connected it to a terminal. "This will copy their records," he whispered. "If Adam was right, this will prove Hale's network." Frank scanned the room. No sign of his son. He was about to step forward when a voice came from behind him. "Dad." Frank froze. Slowly, he turned. Adam stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes sharp. For a moment, neither moved. The years of silence between them filled the space heavier than any gunfire. "You shouldn't be here," Adam said quietly. Frank's throat tightened. "Neither should you." Adam glanced at Carter, then back to Frank. "You don't understand. If Hale sees you here, it's over, for both of us. I've been building this cover for months. One wrong move and everything collapses." Frank stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I know. I've seen the drive. I've seen your message. You've been fighting this alone, Adam. You don't have to anymore." Adam's jaw clenched, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want you involved. I didn't want you to carry my burden. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you could stay free of it." Frank shook his head. "I've never been free of it. Not since Kuwait. You were always going to be caught in the crossfire, whether you knew it or not. The only mistake I made was thinking silence would protect you." For a moment, Adam's eyes softened. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. "Then help me finish this. But promise me, if I don't make it out, you'll carry it the rest of the way." Frank's voice hardened. "No. We both walk out of here. Carter hissed from the terminal. "We've got company." Footsteps echoed down the hall. Armed men. Hale's operatives. Frank and Adam locked eyes, father and son, soldier and infiltrator, before moving as one. They ducked behind the server racks, pistols drawn. Carter yanked his device free, shoving it into his bag. The first guard entered. Frank fired, the shot muffled but precise. The man dropped before he could raise the alarm. Adam moved quickly, disabling the second with a strike to the throat. The room filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder, the hum of servers now accompanied by the sound of labored breathing. More footsteps. More voices. They didn't have long. Out the back, Adam whispered. They sprinted through a maintenance corridor, emerging into the cold night air. Sirens blared inside the compound now, lights flooding the yard. Frank grabbed Adam's arm. "Which way?" Adam pointed north. "There's a gap in the fence line past the dormitories. Hale doesn't trust his recruits enough to show them, but I found it months ago." They ran together, Carter close behind. Shouts echoed across the compound, searchlights sweeping wildly. Frank's lungs burned, but he pushed forward, keeping pace with his son. They reached the fence, slipped through the gap, and disappeared into the trees beyond. Hours later, they regrouped in the safe house. Carter dumped the copied files onto a secure drive, his face pale with awe as he scrolled through the data. "This is it. Proof of everything. Shell accounts, contractors, transfers. Enough to bury Hale and everyone tied to him." Adam slumped into a chair, exhausted, sweat still dripping from his brow. Frank sat across from him, studying his son quietly. For the first time in years, there was no distance, no walls. Just two men bound by blood and battle scars. "You carried this alone," Frank said softly. Adam shook his head. "I carried it because you taught me what it means to protect the people you love." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Frank reached across the table and gripped his son's hand firmly. The reconnection, fragile and long overdue, had finally begun. Weeks later, Adam and Julia vanished into a witness protection program, given new names, new lives, far from Hale's reach. The files Frank and Carter delivered set off a storm in Washington, indictments rolling out like thunder, though many of the most powerful still found ways to slip through the cracks. Frank, meanwhile, retreated to a quiet town in North Carolina, living alone in a small house surrounded by pine woods. No more operatives, no more secret meetings. Just silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence of guilt anymore. It was different, lighter, peaceful. Every night, he sat in his chair by the window, a single photograph resting on the shelf nearby. Adam at 7 years old, smiling wide, baseball glove too big for his hand. Frank never received another mysterious message. And he didn't want to. Because now, silence was no longer a burden. It was the gift of knowing his son was alive, safe, and finally free.